Well, I am now happy to call this meeting to order. I wish everyone a good afternoon and welcome everyone here to today's subcommittee hearing on the Environmental Protection Agency's FY08 Science and Technology budget request. Environmental issues present increasing challenges for our country. We all want a robust economy and access to products and services that sustain and improve our quality of life. We also want a clean, healthy environment. It is through our investments in research and development that we have been able to strike a balance between environmental protection and economic growth. A clean, healthy environment is not a luxury, it's a necessity. For example, when water pollution problems result in beach closures or closure of fisheries, water pollution becomes a threat to public health and to the economic health of communities dependent upon recreation and fisheries. Unfortunately, the administration has failed for the fourth consecutive year to offer a budget that will enable us to achieve further successes in environmental protection. 4 years ago, the EPA's research budget sustained a 5% cut. In FY06, it was reduced again by 2%, and this year's proposal further reduces that budget yet again. Sustainability cannot be achieved by EPA and our society if the agency cannot find a way to sustain the programs that support environmental protection in this country. EPA cannot advance environmental research without a retreating budget, or with a retreating budget. Targets for cuts include programs studying children's health, endocrine disruptors, toxic waste cleanup, pesticides, ecosystem research, technology verification programs, and global climate change. Cuts to the STAR grant and fellowship program not only reduces funding for research, it reduces essential funds for training the environmental scientists of the future. The bottom line is, this budget is inadequate to support the kind of research and development enterprise we need to find creative solutions to environmental problems. I believe several of our witnesses today will be in agreement with me. First, I want to welcome our entire distinguished panel to this afternoon's hearing. I look forward to your testimony and to your recommendations for improving EPA's scientific enterprise. And at this time, I'll recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Inglis of South Carolina, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon. Thank you for holding this hearing about the President's fiscal year 2008 request for the Environmental Protection Agency's Science and Technology account. Most of the budget request before the Congress relates to the regulatory functions of the EPA, and of course that's to be expected. The EPA also has within its request the Office of Science and Technology and the Office of Research and Development. Research from those offices is used to improve the regulatory framework of the EPA. I trust that the objective of that research is to use science to continually improve the regulatory framework. As we discuss the proposed FY08 budget request for EPA science and technology funding, I hope that the panel will help establish the priorities of the use of EPA's science resources. By investing in EPA's scientific research and development today, we can get better regulations for tomorrow. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I'm especially pleased to welcome Dr. Bruce Coull of the University of South Carolina here. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the hearing.
You're welcome. Thank you, Mr. Inglis. And I ask unanimous consent that all additional opening statements submitted by subcommittee members be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. And it's my pleasure to introduce the excellent panel of witnesses that we have with us this afternoon. Dr. George Gray is the Assistant Administrator for the Office of Research and Development and Science Advisor with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Dr. M. Granger Morgan is the Chair of EPA's Science Advisory Board. In addition, Dr. Morgan is a Lord Chair Professor in Engineering and a Department Head with the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Dr. Jennifer Sass is a Senior Scientist with the Health and Environment Division of the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC. And at this time, I'll recognize Representative Inglis for an introduction of Dr. Coull.
And we're particularly pleased, as I mentioned, to welcome Dr. Bruce Coull of the Dean Emeritus of the University of South Carolina School of the Environment and a member of the National Council on Science and the Environment. We're particularly pleased to have you here today, sir.
Thank you, Mr. English, and welcome to all of you. You'll each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When all 4 of you have completed your testimony, we will begin with questions, and each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. Dr. Gray, please begin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the fiscal year 2008 budget request from the Environmental Protection Agency. In keeping with the President's charge to EPA to accelerate the pace of environmental protection while maintaining our nation's economic competitiveness, the 2008 budget request includes $7.2 billion to support the work of EPA and our partners. Included in that request is $754.5 million for science and technology. That request reflects the President's strong commitment to ensure that environmental regulations to protect human health and the environment are based on the best available science. The request demonstrates the President's continued commitment to provide the resources needed to address our nation's highest environmental research priorities, enabling us to protect our environment while sustaining our environmental growth. The request includes $539.8 million for the Office of Research and Development to continue the work of providing the sound science that informs the agency's decision. 95% of those resources are in that S&T budget. We're always looking forward in ORD for ways to become more efficient and effective at both producing and assessing the best available scientific information to inform environmental decision making, and that's reflected in our proposed budget. For example, in fiscal year 2008, at the advice of the Science Advisory Board, our Board of Scientific Counselors, the National Academy of Sciences, and others, we are combining our $12.3 million air toxics program with our $66.5 million National Ambient Air Quality Standards research program into an integrated air research program with increased resources. And that reflects a shift to a more holistic view, a more holistic approach for the science that addresses the challenges of air pollution. We're also requesting increased funding for high priority work, including clean air, human health risk assessment, and research to study the fate, transport, and other issues that might be associated with nanomaterials. Now, at EPA, we are good stewards of our environment, but we're also good stewards of our nation's tax dollars. Importantly, this budget request will enable ORD to continue to fund critical research on the restoration of large floodplain rivers, develop decision support tools that enable managers to balance ecosystem requirements with human needs, and emphasize the development of methods to characterize the services that are provided by ecosystems. The point is that this budget will enable ORD to continue to fund research and meet our critical performance commitments. In addition to these areas of increased emphasis, I'd like to highlight some work that EPA and ORD have done over the last year, contributions we've made and continue to make in a number of other key areas, including clean air, risk assessment, nanotechnology, homeland security, and global change. The President's fiscal year 2008 budget includes a major commitment to strengthening the science that supports the agency's efforts to ensure clean air for all Americans. The President is requesting $8.1 million for air quality research, which is a $3.4 million increase over the fiscal year 2007 request. A major focus of this increase will be improving our understanding of air pollution near roads. This is an area of special concern for children, especially because of the location of many schools and playgrounds, for example. Using both ORD's in-house expertise and the unique capabilities of America's universities and research institutions, we plan to improve measurement and characterization of emissions near roads, study the extent of human exposure and health effects from these emissions, and examine the effectiveness of potential controls, such as barriers or changes in building or roadway design. Our fiscal year 2008 request also includes $42.8 million for human health risk assessment, an increase of $4.5 million over the 2007 request. This increase will primarily support two areas: an enhanced process for science reviews to support national ambient air quality standards, and enhanced characterization of risk in our IRIS system and other risk assessments. Nanotechnology is another important area. It has the potential to improve the environment through direct applications to detect and remove pollutants, to reduce pollution from manufacturing processes and products, or to serve as sensors of pollution in the land, air, or water. However, some of the novel beneficial properties, such as greater reactivity, that make nanomaterials especially useful, also raised questions about potential risks of nanomaterials for both humans and the environment. This year, ORD began an in-house research program focusing on the human health and environmental implications of engineered nanomaterials to complement our existing extramural grants program. In fiscal year 2008, we plan a modest expansion of our efforts by $1.6 million to study the fate and transport of engineered nanomaterials in the environment. The Office of Research and Development also has responsibilities in the area of Homeland Security. Our Homeland Security Research Program continues to develop, enhance, and disseminate information on the decontamination of buildings, the protection of water systems, and rapid risk assessment. For example, this past year, ORD revised its Standard Analytical Methods Manual that helps ensure consistency in sample analysis during emergencies. Finally, with global change, I'm sure many of you closely watched the release from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their fourth assessment for policymakers. Global change is an issue that EPA is very active in, and the President's fiscal year 2008 budget includes $16.9 million for global change research in ORD. EPA is a member of the U.S. Climate Change Science Program, and ORD's highest priorities for fiscal year 2008 will be working with our partners to support completion of the two CCSP assessments for which EPA is responsible: a preliminary review of adaptation options for climate-sensitive ecosystems and resources, and an analysis of the effects of global change on human health, welfare, and human systems. So by uniquely combining human health and ecological research in one federal agency, employing world-class scientists, ORD continues to develop a better understanding of environmental risks to both human health and ecosystems. The results of this research consistently and effectively inform EPA's environmental decision-making, as well as that of others, leading to environmental policies that are based on sound science at the federal, state, tribal, and local levels. Well, thanks for the opportunity to tell you about some of the exciting work that we conduct in ORD, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. And Dr. Morgan, please proceed.
Thanks very much. Appreciate the opportunity to appear here this afternoon. The mission of EPA is to protect human health and the environment. While the challenge and the complexity of environmental problems continues to grow, between 2004 and the proposed 2008 budget, support for R&D at EPA has declined by 25% in inflation-adjusted terms. This year, the Science Advisory Board adopted a strategic approach in its annual budget review. We asked EPA to give us a cross-cutting look at all the research they're doing to better address four big environmental challenges: climate change, sensitive human and ecological populations, environmental and ecological consequences of urban sprawl, and natural and terrorist-caused environmental disasters. Our written testimony details some of the specifics of what we learned, from which we drew the following more general insights. Because the EPA's research programs have long been overstretched, the planning process in many programs has fallen into a reactive mode, too often playing catch-up. Too many R&D funding decisions are incremental rather than strategic. On the positive side, the introduction of a new system of national program directors holds the promise to improve strategic design and balance within existing program areas. However, the agency urgently needs to develop a higher-level research planning effort that considers and adjusts the balance and focus among major program areas, breaking down the stovepipes within which they operate, better coordinates with the research programs of other federal agencies, benchmarks the quality and content of programs, and restores our national leadership in environmental science and engineering so as to assure that our international competitiveness is sustained and provide the knowledge and technology that Americans will need for a clean and healthy environment in the 21st century. I turn now to a few comments on the proposed 2008 budget. The decline in funding for ecosystem research has continued, down roughly 40% in inflation-adjusted terms between 2004 and the proposed 2008 budget. The agency is abandoning past efforts to monitor key ecosystems, for example, terminating a long-term program to track the impacts and benefits of reduced acid rain. The agency has expressed a commitment to estimate the economic value of ecosystem services. However, the proposed budget eliminates many of the financial and human resources needed to do that. Economics and decision science resources at the agency have always been small. The proposed budget will reduce them by more than half and an associated reorganization will essentially eliminate behavioral social science disciplines that are key to effective risk management and risk communication. An equally disturbing trend is the continuing decline in support for extramural research through the STAR program, down 32% in inflation-adjusted terms between 2004 and the proposed 2008 budget. There are a few bright spots. These include growth in support for the program in nanotechnology, and the small new effort in sustainability research, and the remarkable continued effort by staff to make the best of an ever-worsening financial environment. But that said, we're deeply concerned about staff morale as budgets shrink. There's also a growing risk that as ORD struggles to maintain staff size, an ever higher proportion of funds will have to go to salaries with less to cover all the other costs of doing research. As you on the House Committee on Science and Technology confer with your colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, we particularly urge 4 actions. 1, reverse the downward trend in support for ecosystem research so that that program can continue its essential monitoring of the health of vital ecosystems, develop and implement new measures of the value of environmental services, and create the basic understanding that will be needed to respond to the challenges of climate and new technologies such as biomass fuel and nanotechnology. 2, reverse the downward trend in support for the STAR extramural and fellowship programs so that the agency can continue to benefit from fresh ideas from the outside and continue a robust program of educating the next generation of environmental scientists and engineers. 3, reinstate the program in economics and decision sciences within ORD and add support for for substantially increasing its capabilities in behavioral social science. Even the best science and engineering is useless if it's not combined with a sufficient understanding of human risk perception and behavior. And finally, 4, provide a significant increase in support for the programs in sustainability and global change because these topics are both inherently important and they provide effective vehicles for moving the agency in the direction of the innovative cross-cutting research needed to address the critical environmental problems of the 21st century. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And now Dr. Sass.
Thank you. My name is Jennifer Sass. I'm a senior scientist with the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is an environmental advocacy group, and I'm based here in D.C. I'm a toxicologist and developmental neurobiologist by training, and I'll be focusing primarily on health impacts of this budget. EPA is finding itself spiraling into an increasingly weaker scientific state. It's faced with the impossible task of balancing a decreasing budget with an increasing need for robust data in order to design and inform human health and environmental regulations that are protective. To deal with this, the agency often turns to the regulated industries or paid contractors who often have clients or members from the regulated industries to supply it with data that's often suspect and selectively biased. The lack of resources and staff within EPA leaves it unable to provide adequate oversight of these data or the scientific products, which are often shielded from public scrutiny by confidential business information. Claims. The result is that EPA is increasingly under pressure to make regulatory and policy decisions with inadequate data or sometimes even no data at all. We strongly recommend that EPA reverse its trend of reducing its own in-house scientific and technical experts. These civil servants represent the nation's brain trust. Lacking these experts, EPA decisions relying on confidential data lack transparency, oversight, and clear lines of accountability. For example, the agency's relationship with the International Life Sciences Institute, ILSI, demonstrates how scientific quality may be compromised when transparency and oversight are lacking. ILSI represents several hundred corporations, including DuPont, and reportedly received at least $2.1 million in EPA grants in 2005, the last date for which I can get publicly available information. In 2003, EPA paid an ILSI subgroup to draft an EPA policy document assessing a large class of toxic chemicals that included some of the Teflon chemicals manufactured by DuPont, one of ILSI's members. The ILSI draft was rejected by an expert review panel but it did recommend that those chemicals should be deemed safe. 2 years later, more recently, DuPont was fined by EPA, the largest fine in EPA's history, for withholding data on the hazards of these chemicals while releasing them as waste products into the surrounding water. Just today, a local newspaper reported on a government study that showed elevated cancer rates in the people that live around the DuPont manufacturing plant that makes these chemicals. The FY08 budget cuts funding to core priorities such as susceptible populations, ecological research, and human health diminish EPA's ability to make informed and effective regulatory decisions and to allocate its resources widely and to evaluate the efficacy of its programs. These cuts impair the ability of regional and state regulators to assess real-world problems as well. For example, the budget reduces funding for the National Children's Study, a landmark study that would enhance global understanding of childhood afflictions such as obesity, autism, early onset diabetes, learning disorders, and asthma, and could potentially lead to healthcare savings of between $3.3 and $5.5 billion annually. These kinds of budget reductions or cuts to these programs are also being seen in the area of publicly available information, such as the Integrated Risk Information System, the IRIS database, and also EPA libraries. The IRIS database contains publicly available EPA scientific consensus positions on potential human health effects from environmental contaminants. State and federal and even international regulators routinely rely on this information to support an array of critical environmental health measures, such as setting cleanup standards at waste sites. The IRIS database is likely to slow its pace because the FY08 budget diverts resources to redundant layers of review by the Office of Management and Budget and others that serve no purpose but other than to delay final action because of additional review time. For decades, EPA's network of scientific libraries has served as a goldmine of resources for EPA and the public. But over the past months, EPA has closed 5 of these libraries and reduced access to 4 others, despite EPA's own cost-benefit analysis showing that the libraries actually save approximately $7.5 million annually in staff time and cost only $2.5 million to operate. Finally, the FY08 budget increases funding to support research in new technology areas such as nanotechnologies, but fails to develop a clear research agenda that is actually strategically designed to support policy and regulatory needs. We know that EPA has already reviewed 15 of these new nanoscale chemicals, but because of confidential business information protection claims, we can't learn the names of these chemicals, their uses, or even their manufacturers. EPA is considering a voluntary pilot program now where industry could submit data on nanomaterials to fill the regulatory breach, but EPA still appears unwilling to commit to comprehensive enforceable regulations. Congress should direct the agency to allocate adequate resources to examine toxicity and to develop a robust regulatory framework to ensure that nanomaterials in the marketplace are safe and that unsafe materials are appropriately managed from cradle to grave. We recommend that Congress increase the research budget for EPA, specifically favoring programs that provide publicly available, policy-relevant data for priority issues such as children's health, environmental justice, and susceptible populations. And Congress should ensure that EPA's funds are used in a manner that preserves scientific integrity, ensures adequate transparency, and encourages public accountability. And most importantly, EPA must expand and support its technical in-house experts, its most valuable asset. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sass. Please now proceed, Dr. Coull.
I'm here, I'm from the University of South Carolina. I'm proud to be a South Carolinian, Bob. Okay? I'm actually here representing the National Council of Environmental Deans and Directors of the United States, of which there are 134 colleges and universities who are members of SED, the Dean's Council. The Dean's Council is part of the National Council for Science and Environment, whose mantra is we need good science to make informed decisions. And the tenet of our major discussion today is that we don't think that EPA has had the resources to generate the science that's needed for good decisions across the board in various aspects of the environment. As you've heard from Dr. Sass and Dr. Morgan, the EPA research budget has been declining over the last several years, and my written testimony and theirs lays out the details for you. The EPA budget has essentially been flat for a quarter of a century, while the environmental challenges have become much more complex and there are needs for new approaches. We didn't know 25 years ago about endocrine disruptors. We didn't know 25 years ago about nanoparticles. We didn't know about a lot of things then. It's time to ratchet up the EPA research budget for these new modern looks at the environment, and the tables in the handout give you the details of the declines that we've seen, and you've seen the data from the others. It's almost across the board that we look at this. One of the things that I think we need to consider is what don't we know that we should have known, and I want to specifically give you an example from South Carolina. I have colleagues at the university, at Clemson University, and I do talk to people at Clemson, and at the National Ocean Science Laboratory in Charleston, who have been funded by EPA through the STAR program to look at endocrine disruptors in coastal ecosystems. This is particularly relevant to your statement, Mr. Lamson, about the economic health of communities dependent upon recreational and fisheries. Right? This work that was done primarily in the Hilton Head region, very close to your birthplace, Congressman, and the results are that crustaceans, which are an important part of the industry in South Carolina, shrimp particularly, and crabs, are inhibited in their reproduction by several of the endocrine disruptors sprayed on golf courses at Hilton Head. Two kinds. One, a particular pesticide called fipronil, which the EPA has indeed identified as a potential endocrine disruptor, which is sprayed on golf courses so we can keep the bugs down and we don't have too many bugs on your green while you're trying to putt. All right? And secondly, it may be trying to punt. And secondly, the town of Hilton Head actually uses sewage effluent from the city to spray on the golf courses. This is all within regulation. Bacteria are killed. The water is clean, per se, but it hasn't cleaned the water of those birth control products that are still in the water. There's Viagra been measured in the water. I guess that's to keep the shrimp going. I don't know. Right? And various antibiotics in the particular system. My colleagues at the three institutions had been funded significantly by the EPA STAR program. They are now receiving 25% of the funding. They do not know, they cannot tell us now how these endocrine disruptors are passed up food chains. Am I eating endocrine messed up shrimp? That doesn't do anything to me. I'm well past the reproductive age, okay? But it may for others in the environment. Secondly, we also have the problem with mercury, and that budget has been zeroed out in the proposed budget. The endocrine disruptor budget has been zeroed out in the proposed budget. All right? Mercury is a goal of EPA's from last year. And the goal is to find out where it is and how it affects the population. There's no way that the agency, either through its labs or through its extramural programs, can attempt to look at those things. Promising approaches mentioned by Dr. Morgan in sustainability, socioeconomic aspects, and ecosystems are also being greatly reduced across it. And we can't go into the details of all of those. It's nice to see the influence and the money coming into the nano program. Nanoparticles are an important part of our life. They're going to either be the PCBs of the next generation, or they're going to be the world savers, or they're going to be something in between. Our point is you cannot make science-based decisions without the science. The role of extramural research, academic research, which is, as a former administrator, and I must tell you that one of the best names to have in a university setting attached to your name is Emeritus. It means you're retired and you don't have to deal with lots of other things, all right? But our schools, our 134 SED schools, all right, are producing 40 to 50% of the students, the grants, and the publications of all ORD research. So the SED schools represent a good portion of the extramural research going on in the United States through the Office of Research and Development. We bring the expertise of the entire scientific community to bear on problems. We provide the training for the next generation. We are the people who do that. Of the STAR Fellows program, 88 of our 134 institutions have educated STAR Fellows. That is, the fellows that are declining so rapidly, as we saw in Dr. Morgan's presentation. And the thing that's so interesting here is that extramural research, both grants and fellowships, can be ramped up very quickly with additional funding. We don't need new infrastructure. We have it. We don't need new people to run this personnel. This is out there, and there are very hungry, bright, young faculty, not emeritus ones, right, but bright young ones out there who are very capable at all institutions, ready to do these kinds of things. Just knowing that this is not within your purview, I also want to reiterate the statement of Dr. Sass on environmental libraries, and I also want to reiterate the statement we've heard before related to environmental education. We in universities, of course, are educators primarily, and the environmental education program and the library programs have been significantly cut from the general EPA budget, and we would hope that your committee could work with the education committee to try to make that something we need. Environmental education now, as our Earth becomes more and more under siege, is critical. If we don't educate the public and our students how they're doing. It's time for the science community to provide leadership, send strong message to the appropriators and other authorizing committees, as well as the agency itself. We need a strong investment in environmental research, education, and information. EPA needs to be the agency that takes the lead in this and needs to be consistent with the rhetoric about science-based decision-making.
Thank you very much. So let's begin our questions. Dr. Gray, in EPA's FY07 budget, the agency indicated that it would clean up 40 Superfund sites. In the Energy and Commerce Committee hearing last week, Administrator Johnson indicated that the agency would not be able to clean up 40 sites this year, and that the new estimate to clean up would be 24 sites. Is that correct?
That Superfund is handled within a different office, but it's my understanding, I was at that hearing, and that is what the administrator said.
Okay. The administrator indicated to the Energy and Commerce Committee that the reduction in the projected number of site cleanups this year is due to the fact that the sites remaining to be cleaned up present greater challenges, have more complex problems, and take more time and effort to clean up. Is that your understanding?
Yes, it is.
And can you explain to the subcommittee why, if we still have complex cleanups that require more time and money to complete than the average site, the administration has chosen to eliminate funding for the technology development and verification program Congress mandated in the Superfund law, the Superfund Innovative Technology Evaluation, or SITE program?
Certainly. The SITE program is a mature program that's been around for very many years. It's demonstrated a wide range of technologies and approaches that have the opportunity to improve the efficiency of cleanups at Superfund sites. However, at this point, this is something that is more appropriately handled in the private sector, and the site program now is being closed down, and the private sector is picking up many of those technologies that were identified and verified through the site program and making them available. It is important to recognize that the Office of Research and Development continues to support the Superfund program. We have 7 technical support centers across the country in which we provide direct both scientific and engineering support to the program managers out there in the field, on the ground at Superfund sites, making sure that they have access to that science and to that engineering information.
Dr. Gray, is this an example of the President, again, choosing not to follow the law passed by this Congress and signed by him?
This is a situation in which we have to make, as an agency and as an office, decisions about scientific priorities while making sure that we're meeting our environmental commitments. In this case, our commitment to help the Superfund program through our technical support centers is something that will continue.
I've always been told we were supposed to follow the law. Are there plans to reduce staffing or space of EPA's laboratories?
No, there isn't. Actually, I'm glad you asked me that question because there's rumors and misinformation running around out there. What's happened is we have been asked, and ORD has been asked to take the lead on a study of the laboratory infrastructure of the EPA. We've been asked to look at the efficiency and the effectiveness of our 27, I believe, I'm not sure about the number, of our laboratory assets that are spread across this country. The last time we did this was back in 1993, and we thought it was time to do something like this again. What we are doing is a short-term effort and a long-term effort. The short-term effort is looking for place-specific efficiencies, best practices that are happening in one laboratory that we can transfer to another. The longer term will bring in an outside group to help us look at our laboratory infrastructure, to understand the work that's being done there, and understand options we have for making it efficient and effective. A very important thing to recognize, and this is something that the Administrator said at our House Appropriations Committee hearing, is he is not intending to shut down any laboratories. No laboratories will be shut down, and no scientists will be let go.
Let me continue. I have copies of 2 memos here. One dated June 8, 2006, authored by Lyons Gray, Chief Financial Officer, and the other dated October 26, 2006, by Lex Cadelli, Deputy Assistant Administrator for ORD. They both relate to the preparation of the fiscal year 08 budget and to some future budgets, and both discuss the development of plans to reduce costs associated with EPA's laboratories. I ask first unanimous consent that they be placed in the record for this hearing without objection, so ordered. The June 8th memo instructs ORD to put together a work group to develop a laboratory consolidation plan. The October 26th memo appears to be a response to this direction and invites input from Deputy Assistant Administrators and Deputy Regional Administrators to comment on the draft charter for the plan and asks for their responses to a series of questions. And I have some questions about those memos and this plan. Does the agency's inclusion of stakeholders in this process include a role for Congress?
We would certainly work with all of our stakeholders, not only our scientists, but outside groups are interested, including our union partners, and we would be happy to keep Congress apprised as we make progress here.
These labs are located in members' districts across the country. Has the agency contacted any of these members and informed them of laboratory review?
This is a process that is just getting underway, and at this point, we believe that we have to formulate our plans and understand how we're going to approach this. This is coming into view, as I said, with a short-term and long-term approach, and for that reason, we have not contacted
members. Which EPA stakeholders are involved in the preparation and review of this plan?
This plan is being reviewed and addressed. At this point, there's not a plan. You have to recognize we do not have a plan. We are putting together an approach to look at our laboratory infrastructure. In the short term, we will be looking for opportunities like has been demonstrated in Region 1, where they have a certified green building and they found ways to reduce their energy use 19%. We want to find out how they did that and share it. In the long term, we will have an open process that will include all of these stakeholders that will help to bring in together the data, do the analysis for a longer term look. That, again, is something that we've envisioned being a year or 2 or 3 down the road.
Does the agency intend to, or has the agency asked for input from the EPA Science Advisory Board on the laboratory consolidation plan?
Again, we don't have a consolidation plan. We have a plan to look at our laboratory infrastructure, and at this point, as I said, there is not a plan that we're yet ready to share.
I had the staff look through the congressional justification for some discussion of the agency's intention to review the laboratory infrastructure and development of some kind of a consolidation plan, whether we call it a plan or not. They didn't locate any such discussion. Did we miss it? And where in the congressional justification is this discussed?
I'm afraid I'm not as familiar with I'm not familiar with the congressional justification at that level, but I'd be happy to get something back to you for the record.
If you would, I'd appreciate that. The memo refers to a target savings of 10% in 2009 and another 10% in 2010. You have any idea how those targets might have been set? And what's the justification for those mandated cuts?
I do not know how those targets were set. And the idea of our short-term effort is to look for efficiencies that might help us find ways to save resources in our laboratories.
Frankly, Dr. Gray, it sounds like a lot of this process used to consolidate and streamline EPA's libraries. That process was dreadful, and we are still trying to sort that out. I sincerely hope that the agency is not going to repeat that process with EPA's laboratories. I'll be following up with a request for more information about this plan and the process to develop it. I expect the committee to be provided this information in a timely fashion and well prior to the plan being finalized in May, as Mr. Cadelli's memo suggests. And I ask indulgence of the committee for my having gone over, and I recognize the ranking member at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Gray, Dr. Coull testified in his written testimony. He said that EPA's ability to garner the best science for its decision-making has been hamstrung by a severe lack of resources. And I think Dr. Morgan testified about the morale. What's your response to that? Is it have some rejoinder to that, or has...
Well, I think I have one rejoinder. This is simply anecdotal in a direct response to the morale issue. The Scientist magazine is something widely read, as you might guess, by scientists. Every year they do a survey of postdoctoral researchers across the country. But what's the best place to be a postdoc? EPA, ORD, has made, well, we're in basketball season, we've made the Final Four for the last 3 years. We were number 1 3 years ago, we've been 3-3. That tells me that the morale among our scientists, the folks, even the young ones that we're bringing in, the new ideas, the new techniques, the new talent that we're bringing into our laboratories, like working for ORD. I think that we don't have, at this point, any kind of a morale problem. We've got a lot of very dedicated people, scientists, engineers, and the support staff that help us do what we do, that are very happy working in the Office of Research and Development.
Let me take up a case study. Dr. Coull mentioned, you got my attention with this endocrine inhibitor research, and maybe first, before I come back to Dr. Gray to ask about that, explain, maybe give me some background on how that works. So, and particularly, you understand my great concern is bluffton oysters and shrimp, because my brother's a hobby shrimper. So help me out with that.
I overspoke on one issue and want to correct it. I did not mean to indicate that EPA had eliminated all endocrine disruptor and mercury research, only the external grants in those particular cases. So there still is that kind of research going on internally. But let me explain, is that hormones that we need to live and do well are also important to other creatures in the environment. Hormones are necessary for reproduction. Hormones are necessary for nervous function. And these chemicals, various chemicals, interfere. They're called endocrines of one kind, interfere with these endocrines. And therefore, in studies done on shrimp, crab, and copepods, which are another small kind of crustacean, very tiny but very basic to the food chain, and essentially the basis of a good part of the food chain in all those salt marshes we have in South Carolina and throughout the Gulf Coast. The reproduction is shut down when these animals are exposed to these particular chemicals. Now, this particular research is relevant because it relates to ecosystems, which is how does an ecosystem work? That salt marsh ecosystem outside of Bluffton is one of the most productive natural ecosystems on Earth, next to coral reefs before they all started getting bleached by warming climate. That's an aside. and tropical rainforest. So these are important aspects of the ecosystem. Those systems are the nursery grounds for all of those shrimp that are either being caught on the South Carolina coast or the Texas coast or the Louisiana coast, right, up to about Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, right, and all the way around to Corpus Christi. Right? Those systems are where it happens. Those are the nursery grounds. And as we continue to pour nasty chemicals to interfere with the reproductive rate and the behavior of those particular organisms, we have a problem. The extramural program in the FY08 budget for endocrine disruptor research in the data that we have does not exist.
And so Dr. Gray, what's your response to that, the cutoff of external funding?
Well, first, I want you to recognize that endocrine disrupting compounds is an important part of the ORD research portfolio, and I'm glad that Dr. Coull was able to let you know that, in fact, it's one, well, he didn't let you know, it's one of the areas of this budget where we actually ask for an increase from the fiscal year 2007 budget. It is an area that we take very seriously, where we are doing work not only to help the program offices to better identify and prioritize these compounds, including pesticides and other compounds, but we're also doing work that's directly relevant here, a situation in which we are working on the recent discovery of intersex fish in the Potomac River. You remember seeing questions about fish that appeared to have had endocrine alterations or some sort of alterations of their secondary sexual characteristics, and we're working with our state partners, our regions, to help work on that particular issue.
Yeah. Now, what is the chairman has shown me some numbers here. He's showing a 4% reduction now in endocrine inhibitor research.
In the fiscal year 2007 President's budget, we asked for $9.1 million. In the fiscal year 2008 President's budget, we're asking for $10.1 million, a $1 million increase in EDCs.
I'd be happy to. This is the last, or it's a 4% decrease from the last enacted budget. According to our numbers here, this chart that I have indicates a 4%.
We work from President's budget to President's budget, and in that case, we actually are asking for $1 million more this year than we did last year.
Oh, I see. Okay, so that's based on the request, the President's request. I got you. Okay, so, and talk to me a little bit about the, I'm a little bit over time, but the difference between internal and external. Dr. Coull is a proponent of external research, and you're apparently preferring internal here in this case?
Oh, no. First of all, I'll tell you, the research that we do, ORD is made up of about 1,900 people. At least 1,000 of them are scientists and engineers who are doing acts of science every day. And they're talented people, they're smart people.
They're very good. Many of them, they're wonderful people. They do very good.
And they have a lot to do. And we do a lot of our science inside. We also do work with our partners in universities. Our STAR program that's been mentioned several times, Science to Achieve Results program, is a very important way in which we take advantage of some of the best brains in the country to work on science that helps advance EPA's mission. Even in these fiscally challenging times, we work hard, for example, to leverage that work. We are doing research in nanotechnology through our STAR program. And we've actually, in that case, we've partnered with other federal agencies, with the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, to increase the size of the pot that we can have for our STAR programs. So it's a situation in which we have a very rigorous, very competitive system that brings in some of the best ideas from the universities around the country, and whenever we can, we look to leverage those funds to make sure that we have the greatest opportunity we can to draw on the kinds of smarts that Dr. Coull, his friends and colleagues and students can bring to us.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The numbers that I was sharing was from the document, this document that y'all handed us, and in '06, the budget that was enacted by Congress was $10.5 million, and the request is $10.1 million. So what you're basing yours on is what the President requested in '06, I guess, but what was actually enacted by Congress indicates that those numbers are different. So just for clarification. And if you'll bear with me just 1 minute, let me get a couple questions in, and we'll go to you. In your Dr. Sass, in your testimony, you refer to free or cheap data provided by regulated industries. Several laws, pesticide law, Toxic Substances Control Act, are set up to mandate the provision of data by regulated industry. EPA has the authority to require the production of data under those statutes. Should these systems be changed, or is this a problem of inadequate EPA staffing to review the quality of these data and sufficient peer review of the data provided?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. What you're saying is that there are programs, particularly in the pesticide office, actually, where the regulated industry is obligated to supply data on the toxicity of its products, and also under TSCA, the industry is obligated to provide any information it has, be it its own or not its own. No, and I think that's great. I think the regulated industry should be contributing both its funds and its technical power to develop that kind of data and submit it to the agencies. Our concerns are what you suggest, which is that when the agency can't provide appropriate oversight, either because it doesn't have the internal resources, staff or time, or when it doesn't have the ability to actually get to the underlying data and really do a data quality check on that submitted data. Our other concern is that EPA in many cases, and the Pesticide Office is an example of this, relies wholly or predominantly on that submitted data, sometimes without really scrutinizing and incorporating more publicly available data, often from the peer-reviewed literature and sometimes from its own sister agencies. So, for example, with atrazine, the Pesticide Office right now is relying on data that it has requested and been waiting for from the manufacturer, Syngenta, on water monitoring, but it isn't incorporating data from USGS on water monitoring of pesticides.
Thank you very much. Mr. Diaz-Vilart, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this, I think, very important hearing. Dr. Gray, one of the issues that I constantly run into is government has a tendency to judge results by how much money we spend, not on actual results. One of the things that always comes to mind is in a number of hearings that we've had in this subcommittee and elsewhere is, for example, some of the Inspector General reports where they'll come back and they'll tell us about EPA, particularly in some of the outside grants in a bunch of different areas where they really, frankly, EPA doesn't have a good handle as to if we're getting any results at all. We're spending the money for good-sounding things, but frankly, there's no way of telling. I'm sure there are ways of telling, but we don't have any good data that tells us that we're actually paying for the actual studies as opposed to just good-sounding studies, and we're not getting the results. A couple questions based on that. Is there a way for the EPA to get other players, your other partners, and do you get other partners coming back to you with recommendations of where EPA can save money, can be more efficient? Is there a way to do that? Do you have a way that you can get that source? Does the Science Advisory Board come to you and tell you, hey, look, there's some areas here that we think we can find some efficiencies, or is that something that's not accepted by the EPA? It's not solicited, or it's just not? You just don't get a lot of that. And that would be my first question. Well, in the agency, we're always looking to make sure that we are getting results for the resources that we're putting out, and I think that it's a place, especially if you look at the Office of Research and Development, one where we are pretty confident that the way in which we run our grant program, the way in which we integrate it into our intramural research program so that there's alignment between the work that we're doing and the work that we're asking folks in the university community to do, actually does come together and help us make a difference in the science that's used by the agency. A great example of this is looking at National Ambient Air Quality Standards. We write what's called used to be called a criteria document, we now call it a science assessment for ambient air quality standards. The last one that was done for particulate matter, over 40% of the citations, the science that was used to support the ultimate decision that was made, came from work that was done by us or supported by us. So I'm quite confident that, in fact, we do a good job. On these areas of efficiencies, I'll tell you that I don't know the exact name. The agency, in addition to its science advisory board, does have a financial advisory board. And these are folks from outside of the agency who are there to help us think about the way in which we run the business of EPA. How can we do things well? How can we be more efficient? I could get you more information about that if you'd like for the record.
Actually, I would, and if you have, if there's something that you have that kind of shows, you know, some results in different areas, I'd like to have it. If it's something that even members of Congress can understand, it'd be obviously helpful. Mr. Sass, you mentioned that, for example, the Clean Air Mercury rule in your testimony, and your concern over the agency's ability to implement the CAMR adequately to lack of, and I don't know if I'm misquoting you know, credible or reliable data. Should we wait to implement that, or not, because we don't have the reliable science or the reliable data? And anyways, or should we work? Should we not? Should we wait? Should we not wait?
Well, I mean, my hope is that EPA is going to go ahead on the best data that it has. The complication of that is that the EPA plan is sort of a cap-and-trade plan, and cap-and-trade makes the assumption that the pollutions are shared or distributed evenly, so if you remove it over here, you're really you're reducing the whole pot of pollution, let's say. Without being able to do sampling to look at whether there's mercury hot spots, particular areas that are particularly vulnerable because they have high exposures, for instance, around coal-fired power plants, that release mercury, EPA is not going to know whether its cap-and-trade program is actually effective. If you're reducing it in one area, but one population is taking all the risk, then your national risk may go down, but your environmental justice issues, your populations at higher risk, remain at higher risk. So EPA should move ahead with the data it has, but it needs to do that hotspot monitoring so that it can measure the efficacy of its programs.
You mind if I...
No?
The other issue is that mercury, I mean, what was just said is absolutely correct. There are hotspots. But mercury is also a global pollutant, and a significant amount of the mercury that we see in this country comes from natural sources around the world and from power plants in China and similar sorts of things. And unfortunately, while the agency does have a program to look at local and regional mercury issues, it doesn't have resources to try to understand the global mass balance of mercury, that is, where it comes from, how it moves through the environment, where it ends up. And without that sort of fundamental scientific understanding, there's limits to just how far you can go, and even to knowing whether the enormous amounts of money that power plants are going to be called upon and are being called upon to spend will always necessarily get the improvements we want. None of this is to say we shouldn't take action. It is to say, however, that there are important fundamental science issues that one really needs to underpin the development of regulation, because absent that, you could do things that were inefficient or counterproductive.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, thank you, sir. Thank you for indulgence. I'm not quite sure, but I mean, am I hearing that we should or should not wait to implement? I'm not quite sure if with that answer, you're saying that we should wait to implement or we should not wait to implement. I'm not quite sure. Whoever.
We should move forward with the data we have, and then continue to collect the data we need.
Mr. Morgan, let me just ask you this, because you pointed something about other countries. Is the United States the first country to require reduction in mercury emissions?
Well, mercury issues are serious all around the world, and I can't tell you in detail what the regulatory environment across the EU is, but I know there's similar concerns. But the other point is that one needs to differentiate between a scientific standard. I mean, in science, you don't publish until you've you try to avoid false positives, that is, to suggest things that aren't there. But regulation is essentially a public health issue, and there you need to move when there is strong suggestive evidence, even if it isn't definitive, because the point there is to be protective of human health. And so there is a clear difference between, whether I should say something definitively scientifically, that is, whether I can get it published in a journal, and whether the agency should move on something. When the evidence is sufficient to suggest there is a problem, then it behooves the agency to be protective.
And I understand that, Ms. Morgan, but obviously, as you know, that can sometimes be very, very, very controversial because there's always a cost associated with that. So, but I understand where you're coming from. When I was listening to the chairman, and I tend to agree with his caution about making sure that, Mr. Chairman, I'm not paraphrasing what you said, about making sure that that there's input as much as possible. And again, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but I tend to agree with that. Tends to be your where you come from in a lot of cases. Let me ask you in regard to the IRIS process, Dr. Sass. And again, I don't want to put your words in your mouth either. But you seem to be, I guess, a little bit frustrated for the lack of finalized assessments in the recent past, and point to more opportunities for public comment as kind of like, I guess, further slowing the pace. Could you explain if you're not in favor of more opportunity for public comment in that context? Because I kind of, again, with an open caveat there, tend to be a little bit apprehensive about not having as much open comment, and again, on a separate issue that I think the chairman mentioned, which is totally unrelated, but I just want to know what your comments are on that.
No,
did I read that right? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, especially, you might be confused because I'm the one that's always commenting too, so why wouldn't I want opportunities to comment? The IRIS program, which is very important, I mean, it gets hits every month, it gets thousands of hits every month. I think 50,000 hits a month last time I looked, from almost 100 countries in the world every month. Down actually in July and August, I've noticed. So it's incredibly important, and the IRIS database does provide quantitative estimates of toxicity or hazard, and then you use that site-specific in places to estimate exposure. And then when you know the toxicity and you know the exposure, you can do a risk assessment. So it's incredibly valuable all around the world. They are considered one of the gold standards of the world to be used. In the last few years, they've only done somewhere between 2 and 5 finalized assessments every year. They have ongoing reviews and assessments, but they finalize only 2 to 5. In the budget, they actually promise finalizing 8 a year. I don't know how they're going to do that, but I've talked to EPA staff who tell me they should be finalizing about 16 a year. What's the difference between 16 and 2 to 5? The difference is the delays that happen because of interference. I don't think it's oversight. I think it's interference. The reason why is there are built-in opportunities for public comment and for oversight, and there's built-in opportunities for OMB review, early and late, and there's built-in opportunities for interagency review already. In addition to those, they would now have, I think, it's about 3 more rounds of this, and each one of those will add on about 6 months to a year, or extend the process by 6 months to a year.
Mr. Chairman, will you indulge me in one last one? I think you've been very, very generous. Thank you. When you mention, and now again, there's obviously a difference between input and interference, and I understand that, and you're saying now 3 more opportunities or layers of you're saying interference, not of input, not of
At this
comment?
point, since everybody's had an opportunity to comment early, including OMB and the agencies, and they get an opportunity later, then I would say the intervening several opportunities just become delay.
I think I'd like to get an idea of what those are. If I don't know if Dr. Gray, if you can kind of get back with me or whatever. I mean, whoever can do that, would be nice.
Yeah, we're very proud of the process that we use to develop our IRIS assessments. It's one of the reasons, as Dr. Sass said, they're a gold standard around the world, and we can get something to you.
Great, thank you. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to go way over. Thank you, sir.
That's okay. Thank you. I did myself a while ago, so I'm glad I could pay you back. Mr. Lipinski, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very glad that you all went over so much so I can get here in time to ask these questions. I want to start by talking about the Great Lakes, and certainly over the last 20 years, the discharge of toxic substances in the Great Lakes has been reduced, but we still have those high concentrations of contaminants in the bottom of the lakes and surrounding areas. And of course, there are great concerns about this. As you know, there's advisories against fish consumption in most locations throughout the Great Lakes. Now, in order to address this problem, in 2002, Congress passed and the President signed into law the Great Lakes Legacy Act. My concern in this budget is that the budget request represents a reduction of $14 million from last year, from $49.6 million to $35 million for this. And I'm concerned that the program is going to be significantly impacted by this decrease. So what is the reason for this significant cut?
I assume that's a question for me.
Yes.
But this question that you raised, for example, cleaning up sediments, is actually one of the priority areas for our what we call our land research area. It's one of those things that we recognize is an ongoing question. It's not just in the great variety of parts of the country, both in fresh waters and marine waters. So this is something that we take very, very seriously, and we want to be part of the solution. The Office of Research and Development is about being part of the solution. We not only do the science to help identify potential problems, as we've heard, we also do the science to find the solutions. We have a great group of engineers that helps us to get to the place where we can help clean up these situations. In the case of our budget, we're in a situation in which we have to set priorities, and we have before us a budget that helps us, that funds the high priority science that the agency needs.
So this is not a high priority then?
No, we're funding it. I said this is something that we consider a high priority.
Oh, you do consider it, but the $14 million cut is a significant amount, from $49.6 million to $35 million. Is this correct?
I'm honestly not sure exactly what numbers you're talking about. Not knowing the budget, I don't want to get numbers wrong, so I'd be happy to get back to you.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, one thing that I am pleased to see is the 91% increase in the research on environmental implications of nanotech. I certainly have seen a lot and talked to a number of researchers. I believe that nanotech could possibly really be the next industrial revolution, as it is, as the proponents say that it is. And so I'm happy to see that we're putting more funding into researching the environmental implications of nanotech. I don't know if there's any really negative environmental impact here, but it's something that I think we need to do more research on to know for sure, and also so that the public has some concerns over nanotech, and I think that also needs to be put to rest, if indeed it should be put to rest. Now, could Dr. Gray or anyone else who wants to elaborate on this talk about the current research agenda that the EPA has regarding nanotech?
Well, I'd certainly be happy to start there. I think this is a situation that is a great example of the way in which the agency identified something kind of out on the horizon, used our STAR grant program to begin research back in 2001. We were funding research on nanotechnology back in 2001. as it has become more clear that this is an issue that we have to look at both from an application side, how can we use nanotechnology to clean up the environment, to make processes cleaner, to reduce waste, but also the implications, that is, are there potential health effects? We have increased our efforts here, and in fact the funding that we asked for in this president's budget is to bring some research in-house, to use our in-house scientists to help to address some key issues. And here what we've done, the National Nanotech Initiative across the government is spending lots of money on nanotechnology. We've worked very hard to identify where it is that there's a niche for EPA where our knowledge and our expertise can make a difference and where people aren't doing this research. And what you'll see here is that our focus is on, for the 2008 budget, on the fate and transport of nanomaterials in the environment. That is, what happens to them when they get out. We know that in some cases, in some kinds of media in water, they can glom up and become no longer nanomaterials. And then they're a different kind of a risk. In other cases, they may stay dispersed, they may be able to travel long distances, and we're trying to understand that. In our STAR program, we continue to fund work in universities around the country looking at potential health implications of nanotechnology so that we can understand whether there are risks of this technology that we need to manage to get some of those benefits that you described.
Thank you. Anyone else have any comments on that?
Yeah, the SAB, the Science Advisory Board, looked at this new program and is quite positive about it. It's made significant progress since we looked at it last year, and I would agree that understanding the fate and transport is really quite important. At the same time, we also expressed a concern, which is that if one approached the regulation of nanomaterials in the same way that we've approached, say, the regulation of chemicals, that is, with extensive toxicological tests for each new particle type, we're going to get swamped. I mean, we already have been swamped with chemicals because you can make new chemicals faster than you can run the toxicological studies. And if you think that's bad, material scientists can make new nanoparticles even more rapidly. And, you know, if the molecule sticks out there or sticks out here, it can have very different toxicological properties. So the one thing we would hope the agency starts doing as well is trying to figure out some new ways to frame and think about the regulatory problem. Because the simple notion that every time I come forward with a new particle, I'm going to have to run a full-bore set of animal tox tests and so on, I mean, that isn't going to work. And so while we are very positive about the fate and transport issue, it's a critical first step. There is an important second step that we've urged the agency to take, and I think they've heard us, but so far, you know, it's still a nascent program. You want to add?
The first research, as I remember, in nanotech in the EPA and nano environment came out of a program called Exploratory Research. This was an extramural funded program out to universities and colleges around the country. And it was from there, as I remember, that we saw the first implications and studies in this. The entire program in exploratory research, that is, what kind of ideas are out there in this academic, intellectual, and or consulting world that are looking ahead in the future and seeing issues that are going to occur. I think the first, and I'm trying to remember the dates, and I don't have them exactly in my head, but it was in the late 90s where we saw nano research, and then we now have an initiative on nano, and that's great, and I'm really supportive of that, and I think that's really important for us to do. But the whole concept of exploratory research, what's the problems, what are the problems in 2015 that we're going to be looking at, would be a really nice thing to see, to let the intellectual, bright young minds of the future have an input into these kinds of things. And we don't have that anymore at the ORD at EPA, per se. It's all sort of prescribed and defined within certain categories: endocrine disruptors, nano, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you.
Mr. Inglis.
I want to follow up on Mr. Lipinski's line of questioning there about the about nanotechnology. In particular, Dr. Coull, you mentioned earlier that it's either the you said the PCB of the future or the world saver. So back up and tell me a little bit about that so that I can understand how it could be the PCB.
I think others have spoken to that issue, is that what are the environmental consequences of this?
Right.
And we don't know.
Right.
But are we going to make major breakthroughs and have stints that we can put made out of nanoparticles that are going to save our lives from having heart attacks and things? We're starting to know about those things, but we don't know a lot about them either. And that's why I made that comment, is that those who are interested in nanotechnology to make new products to sell on the market are telling us that this is the best thing since, traditionally sliced bread. But, those of us who are concerned with the environment, where are those? Are they going to wind up in the sediments of the Great Lakes, like the PCBs have done, or in Charleston Harbor, right, of the future? And I don't know the answer to that. And that's why I think we need research to look at what's the effect of these. Our colleagues, again, at USC and at the National Marine Fisheries Lab, looking at the effects of nanotubules on attracting contaminants in sediments. That's all I can tell you. And I don't know the results of their research. And that's funded by the STAR program also.
Dr. Morgan,
if I could just add something. I mean, we all talk about nanomaterials as though there's some uniform set of things. In fact, of course, it's an enormous heterogeneous bunch of stuff. And if I put nanoparticles in paint on a new car to make it shiny, it's probably not going to pose any significant health risk because it's all bound up in a paint matrix. On the other hand, if I'm producing monodisperse submicron material that can penetrate the blood-brain barrier to take a medication to the brain, then I have to worry a bit about whether it might do other things as well. And so it's a very complex domain. And, we need to be careful not to think about all of these topics as though they are exactly the same. I mean, I don't worry too much if it's embedded in the matrix of a paint, and I worry quite a bit if it's monodispersed. But as Dr. Gray said, one of the things you have to quickly understand is how these things behave in the environment. I mean, very fine particles in the atmosphere, this room is full of them, quickly adhere to larger ones. And so, does the particle then retain its same properties when I inhale it? We don't know the answer in many cases, and that's why some basic research is important in this field as well as some applied research to support regulation.
Yeah, and Dr. Gray, you mentioned in your testimony, I believe, that you're comfortable with the research budget for that, I guess precisely what Dr. Morgan was just mentioning.
Yeah, this budget gives us the resources we need in this case to look at nanotechnology and really to do it in a multi-pronged approach. We are still much of our early research focused, as several people have mentioned, on some of the potential environmental applications of nanotechnology. And there are some great examples. There are things being demonstrated using, in fact, at Carnegie Mellon, using zero-valent nanoparticles of iron to clean up chlorinated solvents that have contaminated groundwater. A great use of it. What we've done more and more is to focus on implications. That is, how do we understand what might be happening, what might be some adverse effects. We've had STAR grant studies looking at the absorption through skin of these nanoparticles to help address some of these questions that Dr. Morgan raised. And then what we're doing now is bringing some of this research in-house to use our smarts. We've got great engineers who are very excited about this area to understand what it means when these materials get out into the environment, how people might be exposed. So this budget gives us the resources we need to really get a great start on that.
Yeah. One other question, Dr. Gray. You mentioned the air pollution near roads initiative. Tell me a little bit more about that. It's particularly significant for those of us that have a non-attainment issue.
This is something that, again, came out of some of the research that we've supported primarily in the area of particulate air pollution. One of the big areas of focus in our clean air effort, one of the big parts of our STAR program, are particulate air pollution centers that we fund at universities across the country. And one of the things that's come out of some of the epidemiology there are hints that there may be differential risks around roadways. And so what we're doing is making sure that we start focusing our research, both the folks that we've got in ORD and the research that we're doing in our particle centers, to think about this near roadway exposure. And also then to think not only about how it happens, but what the health effects might be, and back to one of the things I think is important to remember that ORD does, what are some solutions that we might have?
Great. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Morgan, does the SAB find the EPA's annual budget presentation to Congress to be straightforward? Does the presentation provide a clear picture of what funds the agency is requesting and the programs that are receiving increases and decreases?
We have trouble unscrambling the numbers from time to time, as I suspect you may also. We got probably one of the better briefings this year from the agency that we've had in quite a while. We asked them to show us, and I think you held up the presentation that we got, where the budget had undergone significant decreases and increases. But you know, there are, particularly this year with operating under a continuing resolution, and the fact that it's really hard to know how in the current fiscal year the money is going to get allocated within or across programs. It's been a bit of a struggle.
Anyone else want to make a comment? I got a couple more questions, but
I actually did my best analysis of the budget by looking at the presentation of ORD to the Scientific Advisory Board, because there's no numbers associated with the different programs.
Dr. Coull?
We had trouble understanding the budget.
Okay. A number of years, 10 years ago, as a matter of fact, I created the Congressional Caucus on Missing and Exploited Children. I have a lot of interest in children and child safety and issues and while this doesn't have to do with a child abduction issue, it does have something to do with children's health and safety. Protecting the health of our children is important. It's an important part of EPA's mission. In your testimony, Dr. Gray, you state that EPA's, quote, human health research funding will allow us to conduct research regarding the health risks of susceptible populations, unquote. But in fact, the President is proposing to cut the funding to help protect children and the elderly by 7%. Is that correct?
Again, sir, I don't know exactly which line you're speaking to, so I don't know. If you have a more precise question, I'd be happy to get back to you with budget and with the exact numbers.
It appears to me that it goes from $61.5 million to $56.8 million, which is a decrease of $4.7 million. Let me ask Dr. Coull. In Dr. Gray's testimony, he argues that, quote, at EPA, we are good stewards of our environment and good stewards of our nation's tax dollars, unquote. However, in your testimony, you discuss many emerging new environmental threats, including avian influenza, episodic diseases such as cholera, toxicants such as arsenic and mercury. Without additional research, could these emerging threats be expensive for the U.S. government to address or contain? If we underinvest in environmental research, are we being good stewards of our taxpayers' dollars? Because will it not cost us through the nose in the future?
Absolutely. Money spent up front to know things is better than having to spend it after the case. I mean, that's said. In the environmental world, we call this the precautionary principle. We would like to have precaution on certain things that may be brought about by environmental change. You know, are we going to have palm trees in Maine? You know, that's not the same level of issues that you're talking about, but are we going to have malaria in Florida? And these are environmental issues related to global climate change. So certainly, EPA cannot afford to do them now under the budget that I've seen for the last several years in the present budget. So it will cost us more later than now to do this.
That is a huge concern. It should be a huge concern to all of us, and I hope it is to you as well, Dr. Gray. And I made my comments strongly earlier, and I feel very strongly about them. This is an agency that the people of the United States of America rely on, And we need to see that same kind of care and concern, and particularly when our Congress, and these budgets have been pushed forth by a Republican Congress prior and signed by our Republican president. And it's not about partisanship. I don't know whether my kids are going to grow up to be Democrats or Republicans, but I know that I want them to grow up to be healthy. And we do have that obligation. We are the stewards of their future. I don't feel like we're honoring that. So I would beg you to please go look again and do what Congress asks. That's why we have a procedure. And then if you don't agree with it, then come back and bring realistic information to us. I think it's a catastrophe for us to see the kinds of things that are happening right now and putting us in huge jeopardy for our future. And with that, I will turn to the ranking member again.
I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses for appearing.
Likewise. I thank you for your tolerance this afternoon, all of you for taking the time and for bringing your information up here. Your testimony indeed is helpful. And if there is no objection, the record will remain open for additional statements from members and for answers to any follow-up questions that the committee may ask of the witness. Without objection, it is so ordered, and we are now adjourned. Thank you all very much. Don't mind my being a little lax with our time.